Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here for the second Mondays of the semester. I am IONE's Associate Director for Leadership and Education, Kathy Jordan, and I'm really pleased that you're all here. Thank you so much. Our monthly Second Monday series is really a time to bring together people who are from inside and outside the university to talk about big ideas, to talk about collaborative projects, to talk about things that really require diverse ways of knowing and different perspectives in order to really tackle them. So our session tonight is titled Climate-Induced Natural Disasters, Lessons for Universities from the Global Convergence Lab. And this topic, which is really about how a university can respond to climate-induced impacts of natural disasters and develop effective and ethical and sustained campus and community partnerships to help with recovery. This topic was really inspired by a January study abroad course, which was the Convergence Lab course, in Puerto Rico during those series of very significant earthquakes. So I hope that this session is inspiring and thought-provoking, and I also invite you to stay tuned for hearing about other Second Mondays that we'll have throughout the semester. So now I'd like to introduce two of the Convergence Lab instructors who will introduce our students and get our conversation going. Gabe Chan is an assistant professor in the Humphrey School and an IONE associate, and Jacob Mans is an assistant professor in architecture. So welcome, and thank you for being here.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. It's great to see so many familiar and new faces. I think the Second Monday format is working. As Kathy said, my name is Gabe Chan. I'm an assistant professor over at the Humphrey School, where I direct our program on science, technology, and environmental policy. We'll quickly do a round of introductions, and you'll hear from me right after that.
My name is Jacob Mans. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Architecture within the College of Design. I'll pass it over to you, Phil. Oh, you have a mic.
My name is Philip Holt, and I am currently studying energy transitions at the College of Continuing and Professional Studies.
I'm Sarah Zarloul, and I'm a student at the Master of Development Practice at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs.
And my name is Kendrick Booth, and I'm a student of the Master's Architecture program at the U.
Great, so I want to kick things off with just a little bit of background context on Puerto Rico and its energy system. Then after that, I'll turn to Jacob to talk about how we are thinking about engagement with Puerto Rico and our thoughts about building out a network of collaboration, and then turn to our three students who are with us this January to give their reflections. And then we're actually really fortunate to have over half of the students in the past 2 years who've come with us on this experimental Puerto Rico trip to give their reflections, and we'll go to Q&A. So Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory. In our conversations, it is regularly and without controversy referred to as a U.S. colony. This is part of the dynamic that makes it very challenging to operate there. It's an island. It's actually 3 islands where there's over 3 million people, and there are over 5 million people who identify as Puerto Rican who live on the U.S. mainland. This creates a really important dynamic for thinking about how we as a U.S. mainland institution engages with Puerto Rico. That we actually have thousands of Puerto Ricans here in Minnesota. We actually went to a really delicious restaurant just last week, all the students from this trip, and we talked about exactly where the father of the chef still owns Lechoneria in Puerto Rico. And there's a deep connections between Puerto Rico and the U.S. mainland. So when Hurricane Maria hit in 2017, it was a high Category 4 hurricane, and it's estimated that somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Americans died during the hurricane and in the recovery afterwards. And what's really striking about that impact is that it wasn't actually what happened directly during the hurricane. It was really the years-long recovery afterwards. And when you start to dig into some of the vectors that Hurricane Maria impacted people's lives, it really became a central focus on energy. That there are parts of Puerto Rico where the electricity didn't come back for over a year. And if you're dependent on dialysis or refrigerated medications, or you just need to live at a reasonable temperature during the hot, humid summer months, that this is going to impact your ability to live. And in particular, there are parts of Puerto Rico that are actually quite remote. We spent quite a bit of our time on this last trip in the mountainous interior of the island, where it really is quite isolated, that there are people who live big, large communities that are very far away from any central transit hubs, and were some of the last communities to be reconnected to the power grid. And so there's some real vulnerability just due to the physical nature of Puerto Rico, just due to the challenges around building transmission lines over mountains, but even more importantly, the institutions that made it such that American citizens were without power for an entire year. So before Hurricane Maria, Puerto Rico was powered 2% by renewable energy. So as an island, that means that they imported 98% of their energy. And so when supply lines were cut off after the hurricane, this is what created vulnerability. Puerto Rico has also, since Hurricane Maria, passed legislation to become 100% renewables. In the struggle since Maria, there are some real challenges to realizing that vision. That the utility, even before the hurricane, was bankrupt. PREPA is the one utility. It's a government-owned utility. It's actually the largest public utility in the country. Was bankrupt, and the hurricane did not help the financial situation of the utility. There's also a fiscal control board. The U.S. mainland controls the finances of Puerto Rico. They are not autonomous financially due to the bankruptcy restructuring, and so that makes it very hard to finance new infrastructure projects. So there's some really structural human elements that make the physical challenges even harder in Puerto Rico. One of the key focus areas that Puerto Ricans have really focused on since the hurricane is, how do we think about more self-sufficiency? The public utility didn't connect us back for over a year. How can we start to take things into our own hands? And that discussion about self-sufficiency and being able to provide for yourself is actually quite challenging in the electricity system. We on the mainland would not know what to do if the grid went down. The deployment of batteries, solar panels, the ability to create and store electricity is very rare to have on your own. In fact, as we saw in a lot of places, both in Puerto Rico and on the U.S. mainland, when the grid goes down, actually your solar panels stop working due to safety concerns, and backfeeding onto the grid is called. When the grid goes down, if your solar panels are grid tied and you don't have a battery, well, so does your ability to generate power. Those solar panels don't work. And so there's a real challenge of self-sufficiency and self-reliance that comes with the electric system. And so part of what's happened since Hurricane Maria has been a move towards more what's called distributed energy resources. And so this notion of, could we install more solar panels with battery backups as a way to provide for ourselves, has really become one of the key challenges and philosophies for how to deal with this problem. So some of these efforts include some very, very small configurations, like we'll talk about in a little bit, individual trailers or shipping containers that are self-contained, power generators with solar panels, with battery backups, and provide some amount of cell phone charging and refrigeration. Some are slightly larger, like a microgrid or a mini grid that maybe interconnects, let's say, 5 to 20 households. And there's some other visions right now for Puerto Rico's energy transition that involve dividing the island into 8 or so regions and creating microgrids there, where if there's another natural disaster like Hurricane Maria, the island could, what's called actually island itself into separate mini grids through the island, so that the whole grid doesn't go down just when part of it becomes vulnerable. One of the challenges after Maria was that parts of the grid started to be repaired, and then they would turn on a power plant, and then the grid would collapse again because demand exceeded supply. One of the challenges with electricity is that supply must always equal demand, and when it falls out of balance, then the whole system trips and falls down. So this push towards microgrids, more distributed resources, has really been part of the opportunity and challenge in Puerto Rico system. How to think about new kinds of technology configurations that are more resilient. So while we're in Puerto Rico, as Kathy mentioned, we were there on about our third or fourth day for a very intense set of earthquakes. There was a 6.4 earthquake, which if you're not a Californian. This is like, imagine sitting in one of these chairs, someone coming up behind and shaking for 30 seconds or so. I thought someone was trying to wake me up. It was really violent and quite scary. But one of the things that was really striking was that it wasn't just one 6.4 earthquake. There were actually 7 earthquakes above Category 5. There were over 30 earthquakes over 4.5. Those were all earthquakes you can feel. This, what's called an earthquake swarm, just created this entire feeling of unease throughout our trip, that we never knew when the next earthquake would be. We were just commenting, sitting right here just before we started, that this floor actually vibrates a little bit when people walk by. And that's still something that we are all feeling because we were just on edge for that 2-week period. So after the 6.4 earthquake, the power was immediately cut off to the whole island just due to an auto trigger. In the part of the island that we were in, which was very close to the epicenter, our power wasn't restored for about 3 days. We also lost water because the water relies on electricity for pumping. So that really changed our experience, and I think we'll touch on that as we move down into our panel discussion, that for a lot of people, Hurricane Maria is still very much in their memory. That, you know, for parts of the places we were where power wasn't restored for a year, that means it was about a year ago when the power came back on after a year of being in the dark. And the feeling of losing power again, and how all the generators come back out and everything kind of starts humming with the loud sound of burning diesel when half the businesses, 3/4 of the businesses are closed. When people are out in the community square, like those are some of the feelings that start coming back and triggering a lot of really emotional discussions that we had. We also, felt a lot of ethical tension being there from the University of Minnesota, knowing that we would be going back in just a week or so time to take water out of the community, take food out of the community, to just be there, and to feel like we were doing a good thing even, or if we should just get out of the way. It led to a lot of really challenging introspection for our group as well. So while we were there, we were engaged in a number of research projects and site visits. We were mainly focused around 2 research projects, one with the Footprint Group to create a resiliency hub, the other with a group in Utuado to create an electric cooperative. All sort of along these lines of bottom-up self-sufficiency, going back to that earlier theme. A lot of our plans changed in some ways after the earthquakes, where we didn't have power, and so really had to think through a lot of what we were doing. But in some ways also didn't change, that we still stuck to our plans and went through with a lot of our meetings just due to an amazing sort of gracious hosting that our partners did. So I'll leave it there just after some context. Turn to Jacob now to talk a little bit about how we're thinking about partnerships, both here at the university and in the broader network.
Thanks, Gabe. So yeah, I mean, I don't think you can kind of underemphasize the experience of the earthquakes and how stressful that was for our students, for us, and the kind of questions that we had as a group about, okay, well, now what? Like, we're in this situation. It's no longer just a research trip. Like, there's a kind of humanitarian crisis component to it. We're no longer just studying disasters. You know, we're inside of a community that's experienced a disaster. And what does that mean? And I think, it's really important to note what we did before we went as a reason for why we stayed and continued doing the work. So the kind of broader Puerto Rico collaboration that the Global Convergence Lab is a part of is actually something that started a little bit before we started traveling to Puerto Rico in January with an interdisciplinary group of students. Directly after the kind of hurricane season of 2018, myself at the School of Architecture got called into my department head's office, and he said, Mark Swackhammer at the time, there's a group of students who would like to see the school have a response to what's happening in Florida, in Texas, and Puerto Rico. Would you help us think through how we might take students and work in these kinds of extreme operating environments? And there wasn't a distinct relationship with Puerto Rico at the time. Like, we didn't have a reason to go down and study architecture, for example, in Puerto Rico. But over the next few months, I began reaching out to different people in those locations, and I think the reason why we're focused on Puerto Rico now has to do with two specific people, Cecilio Ortiz Garcia and Marla Perez Lugo, who are two of the steering committee leaders for the ANESI, which is the National Institute for Island Sustainability and Energy, which is it's a hub of all the different campuses in the UPR system. And basically what that organization does is it kind of identifies all of the UPR energy-related assets, and it finds a way of organizing those and making them, able to be deployed for the university government and potentially for the state government of Puerto Rico. So the School of Architecture hosts a big event every spring called Architecture as Catalyst. And 2 years ago, we invited Marla and Cecilio to come up to Minnesota to talk about Puerto Rico. This is before we had ever traveled. And they came up and they worked with our students in the College of Design, began kind of speculating on, well, what is the role of universities in kind of post-disaster contexts? What is the role of design and creative thinking and kind of re-imaging a situation and either presenting data or presenting kind of speculative potential futures for people who are affected by these kinds of conditions. And then after that, the following week, I traveled back to Puerto Rico with them with a group of 6 or 7 graduate students from the School of Architecture, and we did kind of a scoping trip, just moving around Ponce primarily in the southwest side of the island, but then also going up into Mayaguez, and we kind of did a little bit of work in San Juan. We were working with Dunwoody School of Architecture at the time, so we had some other existing partnerships in the Twin Cities. Had reached out at that point in time and began talking with Will Heegard from the Footprint Project about some of the work that they were doing, an NGO basically working on kind of energy relief projects in Puerto Rico. So from the very beginning, I think the University of Minnesota has been interested in a long-term commitment. I said to my dean right away, if I'm going to do this work, minimum 5 to 10 years project. She said, yeah, if we'll go down, you can lead a studio as long as you want to. I think Gabe and Megan as well have kind of gotten commitments to establish a long-term project, which again, if you're just going and doing, student trips in extreme operating environments and the intention is not there to be long-term, you'll never have the relationships you need to have in place to be able to handle a situation like we handled this last time in Puerto Rico. So in the summer of 2019, then we went and actually hosted our first big workshop in Puerto Rico. And we got basically 30 universities who had all kind of come rushing down to Puerto Rico after the hurricanes. And we all sat together for 3 days in Mayaguez, and we talked about, well, what should universities do different in these kinds of situations? And we had conversations about the ethics of disaster response. We also talked about the immense amount of assets and the potential for universities to do good after events. Even though universities aren't set up to be first responders, in a lot of cases, universities found themselves in the position to be a first responder. So how do we begin to establish relationships with the people that we're working with in these environments across universities to actually coordinate all of our assets so that we can have a bigger impact? In the last fall, in the fall of 2019, we had the second kind of convening of this group, which is called the RISE Network. It's still a thing that's being formed. It stands for Resilience Through Innovation and Sustainable Energy. And in the span of a year, the group of 25 to 30 universities that met in Mayaguez had grown into 150 universities with over 50 community and government organizations also coming to participate in the workshop. It was hosted by the University of Albany. It was a 3-day workshop. We had work sessions on how we can respond differently. We had meetings with university leadership presidents and deans coming together to talk about how they might make pre-commitments to do a different kind of work. Our president, Joan Gable, flew out with me to Puerto Rico and gave the kind of kickoff keynote speech to the group. So I think the work that we're trying to do and the way that we're trying to do it with our partners in Puerto Rico is now being seen as a model for doing this kind of resiliency research. We're not necessarily doing it 100% right. I'm not trying to say that, but I think the way that we're approaching it is really effective. Not only are we trying to create relationships with other universities, which we are. We work pretty actively with ASU. I think the Northeastern University is right now in our house that we were staying at a few weeks ago with our students, kind of picking up on similar research themes. But we're also tapping into the local NGO community. So working with organizations like Footprint who just so happened to be in Puerto Rico, and we were down in Puerto Rico when the earthquakes happened, and we had both the university network and their kind of local community, knowledge, and we were able to connect the dots between our Minnesota NGOs who were attached to a much larger NGO network, and begin being a little bit of an interface between, assets, whether it's a solar trailer or a portable solar battery, sanitation supplies, and then, communities who have needs who are coming in, through email, through this network, and we kind of help distribute that, through our kind of ongoing relationship with Marlon Cecilio and the RISE network. So, I think that's, to kind of summarize some of the things that we're thinking about with regards to the way that we do this work moving forward. It's just really, really important to have the long-term established relationship. I think if you have it, you build trust with your community partners, that's one thing. But it also makes you more resilient when you go down. If we didn't have that relationship in place, like Gabe said, I think the ethical concern about, are we just, in a location taking up resources of the people that we're trying to do research with? That would have been we would have been in a much different position had we not also had these extended networks that we could, kind of nimbly shift our research agenda, go from doing research with communities to, helping reallocate resources to communities who had needs. And I think that also shows the students who went down that, things change. You are intending to do a certain kind of project, and all of a sudden something happens, like the program that we're trying to develop at the University of Minnesota when going into places like Puerto Rico is not to go in and extract knowledge. It's to go in and work with people and to have relationships in place so that we can be flexible to do the right kind of research at the right time. And, I feel really good about the way that we sort of handled the trip and the way that we shifted our research agenda in January to kind of make the most of what could have been, a much different situation had we not had the network established ahead of time. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'll let Phil talk a little bit about some of his experiences.
Thanks, Jacob. Gabe. My name is Philip Holt. I was very fortunate to join this trip. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I would say there are very few people on this planet I would rather spend earthquakes with. So, thank you. Thinking on my reflections, I come from a background that's rather technical, and my interest in joining this group was to learn more about the technical and energy issues facing Puerto Rico. There have been discussions about how it has its unique challenges in terms of being an island economy. It has some interesting dynamics in terms of being a colony. And I was really looking forward to learning more about that firsthand and kind of seeing from a first-person perspective what some of those things look like. And I learned some things that I already knew and reinforced. I learned some new things, and I found out some things that I didn't expect would be challenges in this arena, really to be pretty important to consider. So starting with, in terms of, as Gabe was mentioning, the people of Puerto Rico referring to themselves as being a colony, that was very much underlined for me. And as I read through and saw more of how the people interact with their government, that became all the more apparent. One of the things you'll find is the Fiscal Control Board. Everything they put out is all about how we're doing this for Puerto Ricans, we're reducing the debt, and we're changing the amount of time it takes people to pay back. So the entire perspective, what they present, is all about getting money out in an extractive kind of economy. So that was one big observation I made that was really underlined. One of the things that I learned better is that there is a real challenging dynamic facing the people on the island, their energy situation, and their elected officials, with the balance of resiliency versus sustainability versus what is economic, what's affordable. So when we're looking at building new electrical systems to either replace or enhance those systems that were pre-existing to Maria, broken after Maria, still causing problems now, we have a lot of interested parties, some of which have their own agenda. And there are there are natural conflicts between the desires of the different groups. For example, we have a strong movement for sustainable energies, for electrical and wind, solar and wind power, as a solution to the resiliency problems, the problems of not necessarily having power when the lines go out. And as Gabe was saying, some of those things are dependent on one another. So there's interested parties who want to present certain technology solutions as being the answer to the island's woes. There are then people who are more concerned about the fiscal nature of the island, that they can't afford to be an experiment from mainlanders to find out if this sustainable green energy thing is going to work. They're the ones who are at sea level. They're the ones who are going to be first impacted as the seas rise and as the climate changes. And they're not necessarily comfortable paying the first mover costs to do this green experiment. And then also you have resiliency issues, which is the matter, literally a matter of life and death in the event of a natural disaster. And I guess I'll wrap up two more things. One is that the real takeaway I had on the natural disaster and what we can do is, or what needs to happen, is it really comes down to preparedness. I mean, you've heard this, but there's a lot of talk has been made about the recovery in Puerto Rico taking a long time, possibly being motivated by people who didn't have the best interest of all the people in mind. But ultimately the recovery comes down to a triage situation where you have people that don't have stuff and people that need it, and how those resources are allocated can be done in an ethical way, provided you're prepared to do so. And I think the real failure in terms of the response to the power outages in Puerto Rico, from my perspective, was really an issue of preparedness. And then I'll wrap up just saying, I found the people of Puerto Rico to be so lovely, so caring, so open to sharing everything in the midst of this disaster that they were experiencing. But what I also felt was, I think the biggest things that the people of Puerto Rico really lost during Maria was not the power and the water, is that they lost any remaining trust they had in the institutions that were really supposed to be there to protect them. So it's very difficult to look at people who have been through a natural disaster, who are clearly traumatized, experiencing earthquakes, not knowing when another one's going to come next, not knowing when they're going to end. And the only thing they know is that they can't count on the federal government, they can't count on their local government, and most of them can't count on their city or municipality. So that's a real challenge, and I'm not here to give answers, I suppose. I'm here to reflect kind of on what I experienced, what I took away. So that's what I have.
So my reflection is more of something that I always hear in class, but it's different when I be in the situation. So I have been to Puerto Rico before, and I remember in one of the pre-travel meetings, I was like, yeah, I know Puerto Rico, I've been around. And I went with a friend, and I remember before leaving the island, I said, yeah, this is like seeing the remnants on the construction that Maria did around the island. I was like, yeah, I want to work in reconstruction and resiliency, whatever I thought that meant then. And when I saw this opportunity for a class, I said, yeah, I have to be in that class. We went there, and observation is something, and talking to people from the island and Puerto Ricans themselves are a completely different thing. I didn't realize that there were so many layers that I didn't even think of, like the relationship between Puerto Rico and the US, and the relationship between Puerto Rico, the main island, and the other islands, and then the relationship between the community and the government, the electricity authority, water authority. And all of these things I didn't consider the first time I was there, and the second time I was there, I was like struck by the conversations that we had, as you mentioned, and it was a more of an awakening to me, although I always hear it in class, like, don't assume you know things. And you can, no one can look at a problem or an issue or a project without taking all these layers into consideration and understanding them, although I don't think anyone would have the same understanding as a person who has lived there. Another reflection was, I remember we were at Ponce just before the earthquake, and we had a conversation that really stuck with me. We had a conversation with someone who said, I really want to leave the island, but my parents want to stay here, so I have to stay. And I can relate to that on a personal level from where I come from. But that was before the earthquake, and then after the earthquake, I think the whole thing changed for me. We were scared, like we didn't know when the next one's gonna hit. We were awakened at night by earthquakes, but we had the option of leaving, and we always thought we had that. So it was always like we were always thinking of that, of the people who live here, and then our plans changed completely right then, and I wasn't too annoyed by that because I'm a spontaneous person, but I realized that some of my other colleagues some people wanted things how they are, and they were plans kind of people, but I'm really glad that we got to experience this, although I was just saying to Philip before we got in, like, we were insiders to the earthquakes, but still, we were outsiders to the whole thing. And that I think my biggest takeaway, like, no matter how much I think I know, or no matter how observant I am to the whole situation, things can change so quickly, and so many things I still don't know, and I hope I know, and I'm very, very grateful I got to experience this, and I got to know the people I was with. And yeah, it was a life-changing experience, and no matter how much I heard it in class, I would never have, it wouldn't be stuck with me the way it's stuck right now. So yeah, thank you.
All right. So my biggest takeaway from the trip is going back to what Gabe started out saying was when you got down there, it was the self-reliance of the people in Puerto Rico. As Philip was saying with the hurricane, so many people lost trust in the government because they weren't providing. And so it seemed like everyone we were talking to was talking about a self-reliance system that them and the community were trying to work for. Sarah and I, we had the pleasure of working with Jacob and Swami, who's part of the Superhero Foundation, and they're trying to build a school down in Puerto Rico that's serving the disabled or children in need because the government isn't able to. So they're taking it on themselves to do that. And then within that project as well, they're trying to support the community as well and bringing community members in there to have a resiliency hub as a secondary program of the school itself, because they've got they have a very large site and the resources to pull off something like that. So that was something really big for me, and it wasn't just with Swami, it was with every other community. We stopped at Casa Pueblo and a few other places. I believe even the folks that went to Utuado had similar things that they were experiencing, and no one was relying on the government anymore, it didn't seem like. And for me, that was a big change because I'm from a very privileged background, as I'm sure a lot of us here are, where the government provides us with water, electricity. It's things we've just come to understand and know they're there, and if they're not, we get angry and they come back. Where in Puerto Rico, it wasn't necessarily the case. We lost electricity and water for a day, and I can tell you, losing electricity, you get used to as daytime, you didn't really notice it. Losing water was a little bit different. On more than one occasion, I went to wash my hands, lathered my hands up with soap, and then I was like, what do I do? And so I had soap all over my hands and nothing to do, which are little things, but it's things you just don't think about, and you're just so used to those daily routines. And so to not have that was a big change. And just, it was a life-changing experience. It was a lot of fun, and working with Jacob, it was as Sarah was saying, we had to be flexible. We changed schedule. It's like, all right, we're meeting with Swami, and we were able to schedule a meeting with community members where we were talking with Swami like, we understand everything that's going on. This might not happen, but she got on her phone, sent out an email, and within the next day we had 20 to 30 people in a small room talking to us about what they want this school and community center to become, because the community center they had in town was not serving its purpose because it was ran by the government, so they wanted something ran by an outside local party. So these experiences were huge, and changing course like we did was great, and I felt like we did as much good as we could, and it was a life-changing experience. And in 2 weeks, I would say we learned more than a couple of years in school just from this, so you can't plan it. That's all I've got.
Great. Thanks so much for sharing, everyone. Quick show of hands. Who here went either this year or last year on the Puerto Rico trip? So we have, the majority of students that we've taken. I want to give all of you an opportunity, if you'd like to share a little bit about your reflections in a couple minutes before we turn to Q&A. I know Kritsia and Rajiv were willing to share, and then maybe we'll turn to some other students. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Rajiv. I was in Puerto Rico last year, that is 2019, and I have some of my crew back there as well, Kim and Christy, and I was there with Iljeet, and Kritsia is going to speak after me. My reflection was completely different than what you guys had. We didn't have any earthquakes coming our ways, but we learned so much about ourselves and how we perceive someone else rather than just thinking about someone else and just prescribing things. There was like a sense of empathy that was created for us, or that was something that we started learning about rather than having sympathy all the time. So that was like, for me, it was a big change in how I look at the world and how the world looks at me back. So the relationship and the interface that I had with others has definitely changed in the course of 2 weeks. And coming from an architecture background, before changing or transitioning to renewable energy, I would just like to say one thing, that the best way to save energy is not to use energy. So if we can, as architects, if we can avoid building, like using extra energy than it requires, that's how we can go forward with energy transitions on a faster pace, rather than thinking about strategies first and then applying it to the building. It should be the other way around. Like, you should know what the building should be and then apply strategies to it. And that was my research project as well.
Hi. I'm also a student from the Masters of Architecture program at the University of Minnesota here. I guess my experience, and I guess Iljeet's, is kind of different, since I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and I had moved to Minnesota 6 months prior to this class that I took. And that had nothing to do with what I knew. I actually learned a lot of things about my own country, about my own people, about policies. Even though it's such a small territory, you would think you kind of know each corner of it and what's it like, your spots, or everything touristy that you see on Instagram, and it's really not like that. If you live in a town, that's like your town. You travel every day to the same place to see the same people, are used to the same things happening, and you kind of feel like, since it's happening elsewhere on that territory, it's not as resonating with you, maybe being closer to the metropolitan area or something. And actually, the trip was really insightful, and even though it was mostly structured around resiliency and energy, which is something that I kind of fed off of a lot, in the sense that I study architecture, I actually kind of focused on seeing it, the cultural aspects of it, how aggravating situations lead to people kind of gathering together and like reinforcing a sense of identity. And I'm actually in my last semester of my architecture degree, and my master's final project is kind of encompassing some of these things, bringing how reconstructing a place and spaces is not just about providing maybe energy, solar panels, or access to water. You know, it involves incorporating the culture and the people and how this can be done. You know, it's kind of what I took away from it. And also the school was really great about creating contacts and connections with people. And I think I spoke to Jacob prior to even getting admitted at the U, like actually choosing to come here. We had met down in Puerto Rico while I was over there. And really show the school's kind of commitment to like just creating collaborations. It's not about who has the new front page on an article of like, oh, the University of Minnesota and Puerto Rico did this. It's not about that. It's about actually creating a network of people. And I think that speaks to how many of us are kind of back here in these kind of panels and being part of still like this RISE network. And I really appreciated that. And that's kind of why one of the main reasons that I chose to come to the school.
Anybody in the back?
I'll just say, having done the trip 2 times, the group of students was really different this time compared to last time. Equally amazing, and I think just the kinds of conversations we had. You know, for me as an instructor, I just felt like I was so lucky to have these conversations and to process all of this in real time, and just some of the most reflective students and people that I've ever met. If you're interested in just kind of some of the thinking, we have posted well over 50 blog posts from the 2 years on our website, umnconvergencepuertorico.org. It's a mouthful. We'll tweet it, and then you can find it very easily. But we really have taken a lot of steps to try to document exactly what we were seeing and thinking and feeling. And it's a really great window into, a little bit what this experience was like. So I encourage you all to check that out for everyone's reflections on the trip. Also want to say a quick thank you to a few people. Megan Voorhees, who's the director of ACARA, was absolutely instrumental in making this trip happen. For you Ione folks, you all know her. She's also an affiliate faculty member at the Humphrey School. She just, made the trains run, made the people happy, fed us, just did everything and really filled us with a lot of knowledge and content about partnerships. Really, I think we've all reflected in various ways how central this work about, electric lines and solar panels and gizmos and gadgets really is fundamentally about people and why it matters to people and why it's important to have those relationships in place before you ever touch a widget. And I think Megan has really imbued that insight into all of us and has done a lot of work to make sure that, when we go there, we're not just ready with the content knowledge, but we're also at least a little bit prepared for the emotional work that we'll do too. So thank you to her. Also to Fiola Jacobs, who's a professor at the Humphrey School, who we were able to grab for the last 4 or so days of our trip, who really also gave us such an important perspective from her background, really doing research on disaster-prone environments and planning and community engagement in those kinds of places, and really just enriched our conversations and also fed us and gave us drinks, and so that was great too. And Jane O'Malley, who helped with a lot of the logistics, a student from last year who stuck around to help do a lot of the planning, and Aaron also booked some of our tickets. So thank you all. Really doing this from the University of Minnesota, it was so important to have that support network back here. So with that, I think we'll turn to Q&A. And it can be for us up here or any of the students out there.
Gabe and Jacob, what's next for the RISE network?
Yeah, I can take this. So the RISE network. We're right now working with through the president's office and through Spark to try and plan the first University of Minnesota big workshop this next year. We're going to be focusing on affordable housing and resilient communities. So, the whole reason why we do this work is not just to go down and study Puerto Rico. We have our own issues that we need to deal with, and when people like Marla and Cecilio talk about resiliency in Puerto Rico, the first thing they'll tell you is, next year it could be, a blizzard in Minnesota, or it could be something in your own backyard. You don't just need to study us, we have things to tell you. So we're going to try and pull together a series of workshops in the next couple of years focused on resilient housing in Minnesota, and then leverage all the knowledge of our partners from Puerto Rico. We've been working with a bunch of people from Sonoma County on the kind of post-fire redevelopments, and what are they taking away in terms of rebuilding more resiliently, and apply that to what we're doing, and hopefully through that kind of come to some shared understanding of how we can build houses more resiliently for communities moving forward. So that'll be happening hopefully in the next year and a half. And then we'll be doing another course, I'm sure. I'm hoping that we'll do another course to Puerto Rico next year. So.
I'll also add, sort of along the themes of partnerships, we have a group of students who are here who will be doing a Capstone project with one of our partners in the Utuado community. And so really trying to continue throughout the year and really have this be continuous partnerships, very much as Jacob has done.
And maybe one other thing to note, Marla and Cecilia, who we keep on talking about, they're actually going to be coming and they're going to be guest professors at McAllister College next year. So they'll be in the Twin Cities, and we're looking forward to establishing some, more strategic partnerships with them and think through and figure out exactly what this RISE network is going to be in the next year or so.
Yeah, and we're trying to find new ways as well. There's a graduate student at UPR, University of Puerto Rico, Javier Nieves Torres, who might be watching, who was our tour guide and host and just cultural ambassador and translator and did everything. And we're trying to recruit him to come do a PhD here.
Thank you. You did well, actually. You are brave guys. You make yourself ready such great challenges. For example, when natural disasters took place, it affects the human life. That's one side. On the other side, there's supposed to be an institution who can help that society to bring back where they were before the disaster. In between, to my understanding, there is a vacuum. Now, you collect data, you fully understood what went wrong, you fully understood the solutions. Those solutions should be resilient, and you should be able solving all those problems, all that society or that community who lives over there. My question is how we solve those problems and bring back those people by building such institutions, and you are taking the leadership. So what steps you are supposed to take if it happened now? Goal 1, goal 2, step 1, step 3. So normally we say you can't have 2 without 1. So now we have 1. So how can we have 2?
Well, I'll just start maybe, and then we can all chime in. I think, a lot of problems in the world have happened when outsiders have thought they had all the answers for someone else's problems. This is a complex situation because of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the mainland United States. I think that, just to parrot back some of what we heard, there are deep structural issues here. There's also crisis in human lives on the line, and we know that with climate change there will be more such crises in the future. So I think that what can our role be in this? I think it really is to understand, build empathy, build networks of people who have relationships that can be relied on, And then I think it's also important to use our power here at the university to educate, to do research, to also choose our research projects in a way that can highlight not just the crisis, but as you're saying, these kind of inter-crises periods when actually the key decisions are being made. And also, by the way, no one is watching. I think this is really an important responsibility that we have as people who have this privilege of being able to step back and choose whatever we want to work on in the entire world. We can say, you know, like you're pointing out, that actually the way you reduce vulnerability is to think about what happens in between crisis. I think that's part of what we can take on. And you know, the world is a really big place. Puerto Rico is a place where we have relationships, which I think are critical for doing this work in a way where it isn't someone's master plan for a community they're not from.
I think to add to that, there's a lot of knowledge out there for how to solve these issues, and every community has their own local solutions that they've probably been deploying for quite a while. So I think when you talk with a larger network about what this RISE thing could do, like what can we collectively do to help each other, one thing that we always talk about is managing data and like producing a database of case studies of like successful solutions as well as failures. So it's not just that we only report on the things that we've done that have gone well, that we can sit up on panels and talk to people about, but like having hard conversations about things that you do that don't go so well, and like being critical of the work that you're doing, and not sugarcoating these really difficult projects. So that would be one thing. Another thing is the establishment of relationships or commitments ahead of time, which is, I think, is really difficult to do. But the amount of people who were like pouring into Puerto Rico, just through conversations that I've had with our partners, it's crazy. Like 30 universities coming down, within the first couple of months after, Hurricane Maria hit. Now we know what's happening. We know that there was an immense amount of money spent in Puerto Rico by universities for students to go down and do kind of service-like projects that weren't terribly effective. And if we want to, have universities go down, learn from these situations, we need to find a way to make pre-commitments, establish relationships ahead of time, not go into every single place, but go to the places that and have a kind of shared code of ethics around it, and agree to sticking to it. And those are pre-establishment things that we can do before we even start talking about going down and doing work. And that's leadership stuff. So university leadership needs to step up and take on some of those larger issues that are really hard for faculty and students to. We can talk all day and we can develop projects and courses, but really I think at some point in time it's university leadership that has to agree to find resources and commit to acting in a different way too.
Yeah, I'd like to add into this. One of the things that we discussed is missing is this trust of institutions, this trust of the people who are supposed to help you. And more narrowly discussing the energy resiliency and recovery issue, Puerto Rico has always been 100% run by a government company of PREPA for their energy purposes. And certainly one of the things we can bring is are trying and are participating with our partners down there to bring a new type of institution. So here in Minnesota, we have electrical co-ops, we have municipal power providers, and using that knowledge that we have experientially with things we've actually done here in the state, and helping to grow and bind people from a grassroots level together into a new type of institution, I think is something that we're trying to do, and I think will be very helpful, because there's a lot of will among individuals, but will alone of a single individual does not repair nationwide size grids. So bringing a new type of institution, I think, is a big part of that.
So I have a question, maybe more for the students, both students from this year and last year. I'd like to, do you have any thoughts about how you would like to see engagements or opportunities for students work, right? So you've all gone down there, right, in a traditional sort of study abroadish kind of class, and some of you have carried on projects. But I'm curious as to, what would you like to see either for you or for your counterparts and students in Puerto Rico? Other opportunities or ongoing things university do, right? To now, based on what you've seen, just not constraining yourself to what we do. Universities aren't super nimble, but we can do things. If students really want them and figure out interesting things. So I'm curious to hear what any interesting or other thoughts that you guys would like to do, either based on what this class or before.
Hi, sorry. I'm Megan. I was part of the trip this year. One thing that I really liked about this trip is that we were part of a larger project because we were only there for 2 weeks, and some of us are continuing on and working with what we learned for the rest of the semester on a capstone project, but it took a lot of pressure off as a student to come in and just learn, knowing that it wasn't on us to come up with a big solution at the end. So I think doing more projects like that where you're a student that's a part of a larger process, either with just your university or with other universities within the RISE network, would be really exciting.
I'm Shannon. I was also part of this year's group. One thing that just came up recently as part of our Capstone project is that in order to continue doing the work and maybe go back over spring break perhaps, to continue doing the work in person, because there's a lot of challenges that come with doing the work via WhatsApp or email, which is what we're doing. It's just so much easier to work in person, and finding funding for that has been really challenging. So it doesn't take a lot of money to send a student or two. And I think there isn't the infrastructure in a lot of our schools for that, and it could happen. It just needs some discretionary funding. Is that what it's called? Yeah.
I know it's a student question, but one thing that we've been talking a lot with regards to these pre-agreements would be to have something in place so that, a lot of students in Puerto Rico, their education was disrupted in a huge way by the hurricanes and the earthquakes. So, are there commitments that we can make ahead of time with partnering institutions that if something happens, there's a streamlined way for students from an affected area to come to the University of Minnesota and continue their education, and go back and vice versa. So establishing these pipelines, it seems like a really kind of easy first step, not easy, but obvious thing that we could do as a network of universities working to make our institutions work better for people in affected areas.
Hi, I'm Carly Derwin. I went on the Puerto Rico trip, not this year, but the year before. And I think one thing that is cool about this program and what you could see in more programs that universities are maybe doing is opportunities for continued engagement. So the trip down there is actually just 2 weeks. But this group there's been a lot of opportunities for us to continue to engage with this topic and keep learning. Just the example of me being here today to learn from the students that went down this year and what their takeaways were and how that differed. And continuing to think about how we can apply what we learned here in Minnesota, I think is really powerful, and I think it speaks strongly of the experience that there are so many students from last year's trip here today and that we're really interested in the work and want to continue to be involved. I've actually graduated, so the continuing to see that and building that community so that we can continue even after maybe leaving the university, I think is a good thing. So.
Outsider here. I'm from the School of Public Health. I'm an associate professor. I've actually been working in Puerto Rico through a project funded by CDC for the last year and a half, and we're going to be continue doing this for another year and a half. So we're implementing, probably through Spark. I'm co-leading one of those. So I guess I need to understand more about rights. But my actual question is, are there plans to make it more multidisciplinary? I'm trying to fully understand the scope as of what you're trying to do there and the chances for collaborating with other.
So, so Rise is a completely interdisciplinary, platform for anybody who wants to be involved. There's actually not that many like design schools involved in it. It's a lot of policy folks, education folks, engineers, energy, who have all been coming together to these kind of initial workshops around resiliency. We've had public health people there as well. So at the University of Minnesota, just in the courses that we've been able to establish, I think, again, it's kind of been taken on by a few faculty who are trying to see this thing kind of find its way at the University of Minnesota, but absolutely would love to connect you with all the connections that we have, and we're working with Spark as well, so connecting some of the dots even internally, it makes absolute sense. Like what it actually is what we're really trying to figure out right now. So we keep on talking like it's an official like organization. Like we've had 2 fairly large conferences and workshops now just dealing with exactly that. Like what can it be? What structures make sense for, universities to actually participate in some kind of shared network to do this work in a different way. And it's not been, as simple, I think, as some of us who have been helping to try and form it have hoped. But we see the value in trying to find ways of connecting the dots across not only our disciplines, but, across our universities to work better. So, we can follow up. But yeah, Tom?
Following on that, so Megan and I co-teach a Grand Challenge course, and we had teams working on Puerto Rican issues, but that was somewhat disconnected from what you were all doing. And that was very interdisciplinary. We had students from on those Puerto Rican teams in our class, probably at least 4 or 5 colleges. So that's another opportunity for us to connect that Grand Challenge course to this work, and maybe to have some of the students who have been to Puerto Rico working with the students in our class. So.
Hello, my name's Sam. I just had a quick question about whether, with the hurricane, with the earthquake, if you saw any instances where ecological resilience, so like a forest or a local ecosystem, was degraded and that ended up influencing the community or society. Does that question make sense?
Yes. I will briefly talk to it. We were not expecting to get such a lesson, but we found ourselves in a car with actually the husband of one of the women who was working with the Utuado group, and it turns out that he works and is interested in a farming. Remind me, Megan, would you mind? You want me grabbing this one? Can I just put you on the spot? I know this is your thing.
So, him and his wife have a biodynamic farm. And they're really into the farming network in this central mountainous region. And after the hurricane, we found out that a lot of the crops were damaged, especially the cash crops like coffee or plantains. And so we actually visited a coffee processing place, and they were saying that they usually process a certain amount, but they're only processing like 1/10 of what they did before the hurricane. And for that region, coffee is a really big tourist activity too, so it has affected their economy quite a bit. And then also we learned a lot about food security and how things like plantains, which are a staple in a lot of the dishes, are not as accessible anymore because a lot of the crops were destroyed. So.
One of the groups that we've been doing a little bit of work with is World Central Kitchen, and so when we were in Vieques this last trip, we met up with Oscar Ruiz, who runs an NGO or formed an NGO called Sail Relief, and he's partnering up with World Central Kitchen, and they're looking at kind of a remote refrigeration project. There's a project called Farm to Table, and World Central Kitchen provides micro grants for farmers to basically get assets that allow them to do their work more effectively. And one of the things that they've identified is remote refrigeration, which obviously gives them a lot more time and space to bring the things that they're growing to market and get better rates for it. So I mean, just a small example, but another one.
So, natural disasters are a problem and definitely deserve a response. If there is a silver lining of any sort, the opportunity to see the weaknesses of the energy and other institutional systems that exist and the necessity to rebuild it does provide an opportunity to do differently or better. I really appreciated this insight into thinking about different types of institutions, different physical structures like microgrids. Could you guys talk a little bit more about what are some other, if you had an opportunity, whether it's the financial resources, the expertise, the support of NGOs or government to build better, that you think would withstand these kinds of stressors in the future, what are some features that you would put into place? Recognizing, of course, that there's a lot of community autonomy and input, but what are your reflections on that? Gabe, I know you have some.
Well, we can start with just U.S. federal law that prevents building back better. And that actually, FEMA is regulated to not build back better, to build back what was there. It's actually federal law. So, this limits the extent to which this can happen, and is a major policy challenge. I think the intention of this law is to prevent, too generous contracts to people come in, building and making a lot of money and running off. I don't know. And this is what's essentially happened, and it's really stopped a lot of improvements. So, for example, we learned about a lot of the electric grid. So the main population center in Puerto Rico is in San Juan, which is in the north. And the biggest power plants are in the south. And these transmission lines have to go across big mountains to get there. And actually, the engineers who built that after World War II had to invent a new way to helicopter drop in transmission lines. After Maria, they had to go find these retired helicopter pilots to come back and figure out how to put these transmission towers back up the way they were and the way they had done it in the 50s. So, maybe my bias from the policy school is there are some policy changes that we can make before we can start to think that way.
So what can we do? You some of us in the room were not in Puerto Rico. What can we do about those policies or to have some positive influence on behalf of our Puerto Rican colleagues?
Is there an election?
I'll endorse the voting, but I'm also asking a little bit more specifically than that.
Yeah, FEMA's really complicated. Actually, our group got to meet with someone who works for FEMA, and it was one of the most emotional and complicated conversations we had. He actually, shared very openly with us his whole life story. Part of the Puerto Rican diaspora, grew up mostly in the mainland, came back after Maria, also a lot of personal issues. It all kind of was wrapped up into one big kind of monologue about his life. But, the FEMA part of it, which is I think what you're asking about, was also really complicated because this was a person who really wanted to help. And this was extremely well-intentioned. I mean, he was taking his Sunday to go volunteer where the earthquakes happened. And FEMA, I think, as an institution is really complicated. And I think part of what we tried to uncover was as delicately as possible, try to triangulate how do people feel about FEMA as an institution. And, some people said, they came and they helped us, and other people said they had complete institutional failure. And it was really acute while we were there because some of the earthquake damage actually revealed there was a warehouse that was stockpiled with water and medical supplies brought there after Maria, and they just discovered this after the earthquakes 2 years later. They're like, why isn't this being delivered? So there are some institutional aspects of how our disaster recovery institutions work. But ultimately, that's a federal government institute. We're all paying for that, and they should be accountable to us, so we can work through our institutions too. It's a complicated question. I don't have a real clear answer, but FEMA has a lot of baggage. I don't know, do you guys want to add?
I mean, one thing to just add to that is the way that you go about developing those new solutions. I agree. Like anytime something destructive happens, there's a huge opportunity in how you rebuild or do things differently. But hearing from our academic colleagues in Puerto Rico is that like they have the knowledge, they have the expertise, and when these new solutions start being talked about, they're not at the table. Right, like they'll call experts from a mainland university to come in and inform whoever's going to make the intervention about what should be done in Puerto Rico, and that they're sort of excluded from those conversations. And sometimes even, when we talk about things, we talk about them potentially insensitively, and we kind of use like their misfortune as like a really optimistic thing that we might think speculatively about how we would do something different moving forward. I think we need to have those speculative views and visions of the future. I think we just need to be very careful about how we engage and partner with the people who are actually going to be affected by those visions moving forward. And I think that's what we're trying to do. That's, at least half of the conversations we have are the kind of ethics behind some of the conversations that come out of these events.
I just want to say I wholeheartly agree with you, Jacob. And I don't mean that people from the outside. I guess I'm also interested in what their idea is also. I mean, no, I think it's important. It's a very, very important point to make.
Quick question. I know like XL Energy sent some crews down there to help work. And are there other organizations in the Twin Cities that you are getting some help from and ideas from? And because obviously XL's had a few experiences of power going out, so.
Yeah, I can speak to a few. So yes, Excel did send linemen. Actually, many utilities sent linemen. The MREA, the Minnesota Renewable Rural Electric Association, also sent some experts. They also are doing a solar training, partnering with their Wisconsin counterparts. MMUA, the Minnesota Municipal Utility Authority, also sent line workers as a fellow public utility. They have some agreements to share some capacity in these kinds of crises. And there are a few such examples. We also mentioned the Footprint Project, which also has been doing these mobile deployments. So, I think, having done this now and thinking about this from the Twin Cities for 2 years, we're finding all these little pockets of connections. It's really been quite incredible.
Gabe, we have 4 minutes left. Okay. Do we want to still talk in the audience, or are we going to reflect?
I just want to add 2 things to what you just said. Sorry, I just grabbed the mic. The Footprint Project also they are bringing down volunteers, but they also are in need of more solar panels. Doug, I'm looking at your head because you're the one who asked the question, and especially batteries so that they can try to install batteries like used batteries or whatever they can find to try to do these little resiliency hubs.
One method we call, normally we use in problem solving 2 methods. One we call holistic approach. So you are looking collectively, since they are all interrelated. And mostly you tried using that method. Another method is reductionism. You are looking the smallest unit. So did you try the reductionism in a way where there is no institutions training individuals, families, when disaster took place, what they will do, how they save themselves, what action they will take, how they get the skills in problem solving for themselves. Then the help becomes later. And then when you train 10, 100, then each person will train another. So the whole community will be trained.
Well, I think what you're describing is kind of a theory of change, right? How do big, complex systems start in this one complex configuration and end up somewhere different? It's a really hard question. I think that with our last minute, I'll just say that I think it's important, as instructors to allow students to find their theory of change. I think the ACARA program, who I also should give a big plug to, the ACARA program is through Megan and through Fred is absolutely critical in shaping the way we're thinking about collaboration. And I think one of the key nuggets that I've taken away from hanging out with these folks is that we don't know what the right theory of change is, but we can create an opportunity for students to figure out what they think the theory of change is and then invest their careers moving forward, whether it's in Puerto Rico, whether it's somewhere else, about how complex systems change. And so, yes, we tried things like, let's think about our big public institutions and how things like Fema change. And also, time with community members and learning about how they're providing shelter for their neighbors, and also partnering with the Women's Center to do trainings about how to install solar panels. Very much one person teaches 10 people, teaches 10 people. And presenting all of that, and then, you decide where you want to spend your time for the rest of your life.
Yeah, I would just add, a couple of different scales. We've been working and talking with Resilient Power Puerto Rico, which is an architecture office that started a nonprofit that is kind of working at the community scale for that. Like, they're identifying community structures and they're helping the community build capacity to energize at the community level. And then Marcel Citorice is a researcher from UPR, Mayagüez. He's working on a house-by-house model, working directly with communities and like a panel per house and like what do they actually need to build at a household level community resilience. So I think Gabe said it very well. It's like there's not just one solution at the top or at the bottom. It's like, how do all these things work together? And we're trying to identify project partners who can teach us and we can work with, so we can see, all the different theories of change that might be applied to actually move it forward. And, are we going to wrap it up now? Do we have like a few minutes to close? 1 minute? Yeah. No, in general. I just want to say, I'll close, I'll say like 30 seconds. All the work that we're doing in Puerto Rico, I think it's fantastic. I think it's been a really wonderful learning experience. But I think it's also really important to reflect on, similar situations or similar conditions that we should be looking at in Minnesota. Like, we're focused very much on working with our local partners in Puerto Rico about, coastal resiliency, energy stability, like what are our issues that we want to work on in Minnesota. Me personally, coming from the College of Design School of Architecture, we're focused a lot on housing, and we're trying to find ways of leveraging extended networks, extended peer communities to help us think really critically, holistically for sure, about these issues, and then identify small-scale local projects to deploy and learn from as well. So I just want to kind of connect this conversation about Puerto Rico and kind of bring it back also to what we might do locally to think about our own environment and our own communities. And Gabe, I don't know if
Yeah, maybe just to the theme of today, the world is changing with climate change. It's hard to anticipate that. It's hard to know exactly what that's going to look like. I think the university has a particular role as we think about the world and a changing climate, what we can bring to the table to really highlight how to be resilient to these big system changes that are really unprecedented. Thank you so much.
Alrighty, yeah, thank you. Thank you to our panelists. If they have time, they might stick around, so if you have more questions, we have some snacks, so feel free to hang out. We do have 2 more Second Mondays coming up, FYI, so March 9th and April 13th, Second Mondays. Join us. Thanks again, panelists.